Has anybody got a question they'd like to start us off with?
Brad Van, CEDA State Advisory Council, also working with Brett, IFM on the Australian Infrastructure Fund. So I better ask the question to Michelle, I think, because it's probably easier to pitch it to you first. I read a lot about value capture, but in fact, we raise most of our taxes through rates, land tax, stamp duty, capital gains tax. So all those increases in value are being captured anyway. It's just that we're not being, as Peter would say, transparent about it. And so that's when we used to talk about hypothecation. What we need to do is make certain we grab it as a box and then use it for a project. But I always found that Treasury officials in particular pushed back on that because they hated having something dedicated to a particular outcome. How do you think you will deal with that?
Well, to be very clear, Infrastructure Victoria, will put out some recommendations, and then the government of the day and Treasury will, make their own decisions. There is no doubt that the concept of application or lack thereof is a significant observation. How that will be dealt by, the various treasuries, is entirely up to them. What we will put forward in our research paper is something that we feel will be compelling enough that the advice will actually be looked at and considered in a good manner.
Christine Ganamakis of NTN. I was sitting next to you, Michelle, and I asked you a question, and you said, ask me when I'm up on the stage. You talked about the collaboration between the infrastructure authorities at the state level, but not the relationship at the Commonwealth level with Infrastructure Australia. I'd be curious to understand a little bit more about that, because it'd be interesting if there was a divergence of views from the sort of national level to the state level on all sorts of issues, such as priority projects.
So we are working closely with Infrastructure Australia. I mentioned that one of the discussions we're having with them at the moment is around the national freight strategy in order to inform the Victorian view on that specific aspect. We're also looking with them on how to promote a consistent assessment framework when it comes to business cases being put forward to Canberra, recognizing that there is some diversity of quality as far as those business cases, being put forward. Now, this is, quite different from Victoria, because Infrastructure Victoria, to be clear, unlike Building Queensland, for instance, which produces some business cases, Infrastructure Victoria is at the strategic planning phase only. We're not into procurement, we're not into delivery. So various departments and agencies within Victoria continue to process the business cases and send them directly to Canberra. Now, that doesn't prevent Infrastructure Victoria to actually, have a look and have, an opinion on that. We are definitely discussing with Infrastructure Australia on how to promote the debate around the road pricing, recognizing that there is the need for a national push relayed by, state initiatives. There is no doubt, as far as the road pricing is concerned, to echo Peter's views, there is a little bit of a waiting position as to who is going to shoot first. And we are discussing, with Infrastructure Australia to try to see, well, what can we do collectively between all of the states in order to promote, better informed, debate on that aspect.
If I could add something almost irrelevant, but helping out this table here are doing great work with the questions. Must have been a few years ago, because I think it was under Kevin Rudd actually, COAG decided to have a run at how well the coordinating bodies, the players who were actually coordinating urban development, how that was working around Australia, and they commissioned research, which in fact was done by the COAG Reform Council. It was the only one-off job we were ever given to go and make an assessment about how each of the capital cities was actually delivering a coordinated view about infrastructure, and it was very, very interesting. But one of the anecdotes that goes to some of the challenges here was that each state would put forward a view of the current state of their capital city, and of course it was always glowing and and saying that the level of coordination was, seamless and, and well built and so on. One of our investigation team came back one day from one of the state visits, and they'd had this glowing report, and I said, "How did your own assessment go on the ground?" And he said, "Well, we were a bit concerned when we actually walked into the room and found out that all of these highly coordinated state officials were actually introducing themselves to each other because they hadn't met before." And I think that flowed, and the report itself said some really good work was being done, but it also said there was a long way to go before the multiple agencies that are playing in this space could put the sort of coherent view to the various different infrastructure bodies that we've now got. So there's work to be done further down as well.
Thank you. Could I ask a Victoria-centric question? But I think it might start from the national... Faith Fitzgerald from Regional Development Australia, Southern Melbourne. We might be starting with a national freight strategy, Paul. Will that strategy be making advice or giving us advice about the best way to go forward in ports, including what kind of container ports we're going to need for the nation and where? And if that is the case, will it then be your job, Michelle, to advise as to whether the Port of Hastings or the proposed new port in the west is the best idea, and when?
So I cannot clearly talk on behalf of Infrastructure Australia and the work that they are doing on the national freight strategy. What I can, respond is that the government requested Infrastructure Victoria about a month ago to provide advice on the second container port in Melbourne. So the two questions that we will answer is when will we need a second port, and where does it make, the most sense to position it between, Hastings and Bay West. There is no doubt that we're going to work in parallel with Infrastructure Australia and the work they're going to do with their national freight strategy to inform ourselves of what, they do in that field. Because clearly we need to ensure that this is significant input into the work that we'll do on the advice, which we'll table to government in June 2017. So there is probably enough time for us to benefit from the work that they are going to do on that. But that will only inform us in respect of certain important issues which we identify we need to have responses on in providing that advice. But we will, definitely continue to work, and we are working right now on assessing, both locations.
On the broader question, we in NSW Ports are very sympathetic to the terrible difficulties you have down here, and we hope that you sort them out over a period of time. We don't have them, obviously, in New South Wales, but I had to put up with a speech the other day from a guy from Melbourne who constantly made those distinctions, so I couldn't help do that today. But it's also somewhat true because between Botany and Newcastle and Kembla, the issues are not so much new facilities but access to those facilities. So the issues are a little different. They're just as important, and undoubtedly if we don't get our act together, particularly Port Botany could get strangled by Sydney because we don't have the right infrastructure through it. So I think that is an issue which is very high up. It also is a good example how we can't just look to government to work this all out, because I think, we put a lot of effort and time and money actually into a 30-year plan in NSW Ports, because we take the view that government does absolutely have to make final calls in many of these things, but it is up to privately owned assets who have a stake to play and to do some of the research and to be part of that dialogue. For us, it's very important that we don't have urban encroachment, for example, and that key roads remain clear. Now, state government will ultimately decide that, but if we are not out there working with the community every day and explaining to people why some of these things are necessary, then, one day you do wake up and find out that the state government has lost sight of the importance of that, and you've got a solution that is not helpful. So I think everyone has got a part to play in all of this. As far as some of the other issues, the inland railway is a really good example where we look at in NSW Ports and we look to that rail infrastructure, and it's very difficult for us to actually see what the value add is unless you actually have the issue of what is the strategy, what are we trying to achieve, and our level of enthusiasm may well be revved up a bit if we actually understood that. So I was quite happy with Pierre's questioning a little earlier too. I thought it was a good question.
Thanks very much to our panel. I know more formal thanks will be done in a moment, but just to close things off, I think we've had a great discussion today about the challenges and some really great exploration of some of the options for really growing our economy through investment in infrastructure. But it seems that we've got a lot of great policies, ideas and options, but we're still lacking in being able to implement those, and there's something about delivering from the policy to actual projects. But I'd like to say thanks to the panel, and I'll hand back to Professor Martin to close.